Mil said I'd never be enough now. She's living in my guest room. Some women enter your home carrying flowers. Others carry judgment wrapped in cashmere and call it tradition. Mine carried a suitcase, a ruined reputation, and the same condescending voice that once told me I'd never be enough. My name is Sarah Hyland. I'm 33 years old, a creative design director living in Portland, Oregon, the guest room she sleeps in now. I renovated it myself 2 years ago, back when I still believed I had to prove something to her. Marjorie Cooper wasn't just my mother-in-law. For the longest time, she was the silent third party in my marriage. The kind of presence that didn't knock, didn't ask, didn't bend. The kind that lingered in every decision, every holiday, every word I swallowed instead of speaking. I met Dylan Cooper at a design expo my firm co-sponsored. I had just led a panel on sustainable materials in interior environments, and he approached me, after, with a quiet confidence and a few thoughtful questions. He wasn't the loudest man in the room, but he listened like he'd known me longer than 5 minutes. Later that night, he told me his family ran a real estate development company with a focus on legacy homes. I assumed that meant his parents were retired architects. I was wrong. It meant his mother curated their entire lineage like a brand. Everything about the Coopers had to be tasteful, historical, and precisely controlled. Dylan was different, though, or at least he tried to be. He loved that I worked with reclaimed materials and talked about design like it could heal people. He came to my lectures, made time for my projects, and even asked me to help him reimagine a family property on the Oregon coast. It felt like a partnership, one with potential, until the first time I met Marjorie. She invited us to dinner at her home, in a tall, ivy-draped, colonial tucked behind iron gates in silence. I wore a navy linen dress, with handmade ceramic earrings. She didn't say a word about them, but her eyes lingered just a moment too long. Then came the questions. What did your parents do? Oh, a schoolteacher and a cabinet maker. How charming. Did you study design somewhere? Accredited, I answered every inquiry calmly. But I felt the blade in her smile. She complimented Dylan's choice in wine, not in women. Still, I told myself I was overreacting. Women like her didn't mean to sound condescending. They were just raised that way. At least that's what Dylan said when I brought it up on the drive home. He kissed the back of my hand and said she'd come around. I believed him. Or wanted to. When Dylan proposed a year later, on a foggy cliffside in Cannon Beach, I said yes without hesitation. Not because it was the perfect proposal, or the perfect moment. It wasn't. The wind knocked my hair into my face, and I dropped the ring before slipping it on. But he was the person I wanted to build with, and I figured the rest would follow. What I didn't realize was that marrying him meant marrying into a narrative I had no control over. The moment we announced our engagement, Marjorie took over. She suggested a family friend's vineyard as the wedding venue and vetoed every local florist I proposed. When I said I wanted a dress made by an independent Korean designer I admired, she said it wasn't timeless enough. At first, I fought back. I argued, defended, insisted. But each time, Dylan would give me that look that begged for peace. So I compromised. Once, then again, until it became a habit. By the time the wedding arrived, most of it felt like a polite performance in someone else's story. My parents sat quietly at the back of the rehearsal dinner while Marjorie gave a toast that included the phrase, "When a man of our heritage chooses love over legacy, we must trust he knows what he's doing." I don't remember what Dylan said in response. I just remember gripping my wine glass so hard I left fingerprints. The first year of marriage was harder than I expected. Dylan and I were in love. Yes, but love didn't drown out Marjorie's curated suggestions. She dropped by our loft, with antique dishes we didn't ask for. She recommended private clubs and introduced us as the creative one and the Cooper. I didn't know whether to laugh or leave. Instead, he adjusted. Again, I got keter. Took on more work. Told myself I could balance it all. Then came the moment that changed everything. It wasn't loud or dramatic. Just a phone call. Dylan's firm had offered me a freelance role consulting on a new eco-luxury community. Marjorie advised them to reconsider. She didn't say I wasn't good enough. She simply said they should aim higher. The message landed. The offer was rescinded. Dylan was furious. But he didn't confront her. Not really. He said we should let it go. Move forward. But something cracked inside me that day. Not just trust. Something deeper. I realized I was slowly erasing myself for the comfort of a woman who had never wanted me to exist in her world to begin with. And yet, 2 years later, that woman stood at my front door with 2 suitcases and nowhere else to go. I watched her step inside the doorway like someone testing the temperature of unfamiliar water. Marjorie wore a beige wool coat, tailored within an inch of its life, and heels that didn't suit the Portland rain. Her makeup was still perfect, but her posture had changed. There was a slight tilt in her stance. Something uncertain, like a person used to walking into rooms she owned now unsure if she belonged. She didn't ask if she could stay. She just said the sentence quietly, without meeting my eyes. It's only for a short while, Sarah. Just until I get things sorted. Dylan stood behind her, not looking at me either, holding her suitcases like he was carrying the weight of 2 decades of avoidance. I nodded and stepped aside. Guest rooms ready. The truth was, I had made that room for her a year ago, but not with kindness in mind. I made it because I wanted to stop feeling like my home was vulnerable to her disapproval. I had painted the walls a soft concrete gray, added natural walnut shelves, and stocked it with soft cotton sheets from a local shop she once called charmingly rustic. Everything about it was curated to be functional, neutral, impossible to critique. Now she walked past the hallway photos of Dylan and me at the coast, at my firm's gala, holding our daughter Zoe as a newborn, and said nothing at all. Just a shallow breath and a whispered, "Thank you for doing this." That first night was stiff. I made chickpea stew and homemade focaccia. Dylan set the table and opened wine. Marjorie pushed food around her plate and only asked about Zoe's preschool. Not my work. Not our new client. Not the conference I had just presented at. She did not once mention why she lost her house, or what happened to the legacy portfolio she was always lecturing us about. Dylan and I didn't press. Part of me wanted to. Part of me wanted to snap the silence open and ask, was it worth it, controlling everything until it slipped right out of your hands? But I said nothing. Just cleared the plates and put on tea. Later that night, while Dylan read stories to Zoe, I folded Marjorie's laundry because I needed something to do with my hands. I found myself staring at her blouses, still lined with dry cleaner creases, and wondering what it must feel like to go from curated control to crashing collapse. She had always built her identity on appearances, her home, her garden, her reputation at the Women's Architectural Society, but the world changed, and she didn't. Her old contacts stopped returning calls. Her investments dried up, and she never once asked for help until she had no other choice. Even then, she didn't ask. She simply arrived. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay awake watching the streetlight flicker through the slats of our bedroom blinds. Dylan turned toward me once, mumbled something soft, and reached for my hand. I didn't move. I just let his fingers rest over mine without curling back. I was angry, but I didn't know at whom. At her, for everything she had said and done. At him, for letting her back in without a real conversation. Or maybe at myself, for agreeing so quickly when he asked if she could come. The truth was, part of me wanted her here. Not out of kindness, but out of curiosity. What does a person like her become when the scaffolding is stripped away? Over the next few days, the arrangement settled into something strange and quiet. Marjorie stayed out of the way, but not out of sight. She made breakfast once. Dry toast and sliced oranges like we were living in a 1,982nd diet book. She helped Zoe with a collage assignment and then reorganized our spice cabinet without saying a word. She left notes instead of speaking directly. One said, "Used last of the cinnamon." Replaced it. Another, "Zoe's winter boots look snug. Might need new pair." I read them like coded messages from someone trying to stay useful without appearing needy. She never complained. Never asked for anything beyond fresh towels and time alone in the afternoons. But the tension was there, pressed into every small courtesy. Then, one evening, I came home early from a client dinner and found her sitting at our kitchen table with a legal pad full of handwritten numbers. Bills. It turned out, unpaid property taxes, maxed out credit cards, and overdue storage fees for the furniture she couldn't fit in our house. She looked up, startled, and started to close the notebook. But I stopped her. "You don't have to hide that," I said, not unkindly. "We're not strangers anymore." She hesitated, then pushed the pad toward me. "I never thought it would get this far," she said softly. "I thought legacy would protect me." I looked at the numbers, the shortfall, the reality behind the silence, and realized something I hadn't expected. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel pity. What I felt was something closer to clarity. This woman, who once told me my name sounded too casual for someone marrying into old architecture, was just a person. A flawed one. A proud one. But no longer powerful in the ways that had once held me hostage. And now, the power to define the tone of this house belonged, entirely and quietly, to me. Marjorie began to drift into our rhythm like a misplaced comma in a long sentence, not disruptive enough to confront directly, but noticeable. She never raised her voice or pushed boundaries overtly. Instead, she folded herself into routines, adjusting Zoe's lunchbox content without asking, offering unsolicited advice on my work outfit with a tone too soft to challenge. "That blazer cuts you strangely at the hip," she said once, as I walked out the door. "Just a thought." I said thank you, kept walking, and later realized I had changed into a different jacket without meaning to. That's how it started. Quiet edits to my life, framed as support. Dylan, to his credit, I've tried to stay neutral. He offered to talk to her more than once, but his tone always suggested he was hoping I'd say it wasn't necessary. He had spent a lifetime absorbing her energy like insulation, quietly redirecting tension before it caught fire. I understood that. I also resented it. Because while he deflected, when she reorganized the bookshelf I had spent an entire weekend curating by color and category, he said, "She's just trying to feel useful." When she offered Zoe a set of alphabet flashcards printed in cursive and told her that handwriting reveals character, he said, "It's harmless." But I could feel it. The slow erosion of autonomy, dressed up as family tradition. One Friday evening, I came home late from a pitch meeting and found Marjorie sitting in the living room with Zoe, showing her how to properly fold napkins into swans. Zoe was delighted, babbling about setting a formal table for her stuffed animals. Marjorie smiled like she had just brokered peace in a foreign country. "She's very detail-oriented," she told me, her tone implying the source of that trait was genetic. I smiled back, placed my bag down, and excused myself to the bedroom. That night, Dylan and I lay in bed while Zoe slept between us after a nightmare. I stared at the ceiling and finally asked, "Does it ever bother you that she still acts like I'm temporary?" He sighed, rubbed his forehead, and replied, "I think she believes she's helping. She just doesn't know any other way to exist." I didn't respond. I already knew that. But what he didn't seem to understand was that knowing didn't make it easier. A few weeks later, it happened. The one thing I had quietly feared. I came home early from a client site visit and heard Marjorie on the phone in the backyard. Her voice carried through the window above the sink. Sarah's doing her best, she said, a hint of forced patience in her tone. But some women just aren't built for family life. You know how creative types can be. All vision. No structure. I stood frozen, dish towel still in my hand. I'm not sure whether to walk away or fling the window open. She paused, listening, then said, Dylan's too soft to see it. He needs a partner, not a project. I left the towel on the counter, walked upstairs, and sat in the dark of our bedroom for 20 minutes without moving. My chest didn't ache. My hands didn't tremble. There was no dramatic breakdown. Just a clean, hard clarity. She had not changed. She had simply lost leverage. That night, I didn't mention the phone call, not because I was afraid of confrontation, but because I had finally realized the dynamic was not about her opinion of me. It was about my willingness to give it weight. And something had shifted. I no longer felt the need to win her over, to prove myself capable or worthy. I had already done that, not in her language, but in my own. Through my work, my family, my sanity. But I also knew one thing clearly now. This quiet battle could not go on unspoken forever. The next morning, I made coffee and asked her to sit with me. Dylan had already taken Zoe to preschool, and the house was still. She approached cautiously, sensing something different. I kept my tone measured. I'd like to talk about boundaries, I said, then waited. She blinked slowly, then nodded. Of course. I took a sip of coffee and met her eyes. I appreciate that you've tried to integrate into the house respectfully. But I need it to be clear that this is still my home, my child, and my life. I'm happy to help you through this season, but you don't get to rewrite our story while you're here. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it. After a moment, she simply said, Understood. And for the first time since she moved in, I believed she meant it. What followed was not a dramatic transformation. She didn't become warm, or suddenly start complimenting my parenting, but she pulled back. She asked before moving things, respected routines, stopped leaving passive notes, and started asking real questions. Small changes, but noticeable. Dylan noticed too. One evening, he pulled me into the hallway and said, Thank you for saying what I never could. I didn't respond right away. Then I whispered, You still can. One day. You will need to. There's a particular silence that happens when someone stops trying to win. It's not peace exactly. It's more like a ceasefire, where both sides quietly monitor the line between tolerance and tension. After our conversation about boundaries, Marjorie adjusted. She no longer entered rooms unannounced. No longer rearranged Zoe's toys or my kitchen spices, or left polite critiques taped to the fridge. She returned to her corner of the house, carefully polite, occasionally helpful, but always reserved. It was better than before. But it wasn't ease. It was restraint. And I wasn't sure whether it came from self-awareness or survival instinct. Dylan noticed the shift too. He started coming home a little earlier. I took more initiative with Zoe's evening routine, and occasionally checked in with me after dinner, asking how things felt, instead of just assuming we were fine. It was a small thing, but after years of watching him default to avoidance whenever discomfort entered the room, it felt like growth. We were still learning how to be partners under pressure, and this situation forced us to name things we had long left unspoken. Like the fact that his mother had never seen me as permanent, or that he had spent most of our marriage trying to keep two women calm rather than choosing one to stand beside when it counted. One Saturday morning, I found Zoe and Marjorie sitting on the floor of the guest room, flipping through old design magazines. Marjorie was pointing at a feature spread of a brownstone she had helped stage decades ago. Zoe listened intently, asking questions about fabrics and lighting. Marjorie smiled as she explained how natural textures could make a space feel grounded. That was the word she used. Grounded. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching. It would have been easy to feel jealous, to resent the softness she gave so freely to Zoe when I had spent years earning just an ounce of that grace. But instead, I felt something quieter. Maybe relief. Maybe recognition. She had stopped competing with me for space in Dylan's life. And somewhere in that surrender, she found a new role. Grandmother. Not matriarch. Not advisor. Just someone who could pass down wisdom without trying to rewrite the present. Still, I didn't fully trust it, because people don't change overnight. They adapt. They adjust to their surroundings. But real change takes longer. It shows up in what they do when no one is watching, and how they behave when the stakes are low. So I paid attention. I watched how she deferred to my parenting choices now, how she asked instead of assumed, how she offered opinions only when invited. And I also noticed when her voice caught, just slightly, anytime Dylan and I made decisions she wasn't part of. Like when we told her we were taking Zoe to San Francisco for a long weekend. Her face tightened just for a second before she nodded and said, "Sounds like a lovely break." She never said she wished she had been invited. She never hinted that she could have helped, but the silence after her approval was louder than any complaint, and I couldn't forget the years when that silence was filled with cutting remarks disguised as concern. People talk about toxic mother-in-law dynamics, like they're explosive. But the truth is, they're often quiet, polished, decorated in civility. The damage doesn't come from shouting. It comes from implication, from knowing looks, from questions like, "Are you sure you want to take on that much at work with a child so young?" Or, "Do you think Zoe's behavior is a result of too much screen time or just her age?" Always phrased like concern. Always designed to leave a dent. But lately, there were fewer dents. Or maybe I had stopped handing her the tools. Either way, the house felt different. Not completely mine again, but no longer invaded. We had found a fragile balance, a mutual recognition of territory. Until one afternoon, I came home from work to find her sitting on our patio with a real estate brochure. She looked up when I stepped outside and said, "I've been thinking about next steps." My body tensed. I wasn't sure if this was the beginning of another subtle power move or an actual plan. "There's a small apartment not far from here," she continued. "It's nothing fancy, but it's quiet, walkable, and I think it would be enough." The word surprised me. Enough. Coming from the woman who once said my apartment was charming but temporary, that word meant more than she realized. I sat beside her and looked at the photos. It was a modest place. One bedroom, dated finishes. No view, but it looked clean. Private. Hers. "Are you ready for that?" I asked. She hesitated. "I don't know," she said, "but I think I need to try. I've been a guest long enough." For the first time since she moved in, I believed her. Not because she sounded confident, but because she sounded unsure. And uncertainty, for someone like her, was a sign of truth. She didn't move out right away. The brochure disappeared into a drawer, and for a few weeks, nothing was said. Life returned to its familiar rhythm: morning coffee, Zoe's school drop-off, deadlines, dinners, then quiet evenings where each of us retreated into our own corners of the house. But something had shifted. Marjorie no longer walked through our home like a curator passing judgment. She started asking questions instead of giving opinions. She listened more, interrupted less. And one evening, as I came back from a long client presentation, I found her in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, chopping vegetables with practiced ease. "I thought you might be tired," she said without looking up. "So I made a lentil stew. Nothing fancy." It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a performance. It was just a moment of shared effort, and it landed deeper than I expected. A week later, I invited her to join me on a short walk to the neighborhood farmers market. I expected her to decline, or suggest sending Dylan, but instead, she reached for her coat. We walked slowly, the sun low over the rooftops. passing tulip stands and crates of early pears. Somewhere between the honey vendor and the flower stall, she told me about the first apartment she ever rented. It was in Boston, above a record shop. The floors tilted, the radiator clanged all winter, and the landlord lived 2 doors down. But it was mine, she said. I paid for it with my own designs. I remember how good it felt to buy my own dishes. They didn't match anything. I didn't care. I looked at her then, not as Dylan's mother or my former antagonist, but simply as a woman who had once built something on her own terms before the story shifted, maybe before she had learned that control was safer than vulnerability. Maybe before marriage and expectations rewrote her definition of worth. That afternoon, she brought the brochure back out and laid it flat on the table. I called the property manager. She said, "They still have the unit. I'm going to see it this week." I nodded, but didn't cheer. I knew what it meant for her to say that. Pride had always been her armor. This was the first time I had seen her put it down voluntarily. Not because she had lost, but because she was ready to start something different. Dylan reacted like someone who had been waiting for this conversation but didn't know how to begin it. He asked logistical questions, offered to help with the deposit, checked the neighborhood's walk score, as if trying to prove he supported her decision logically. But his voice cracked a little when he said, "It's a good step, Mom." She smiled gently and replied, "It's time, and I don't want to overstay what was never meant to be permanent." Her choice of words was deliberate. It didn't sting the way it once might have. It was simply honest. She moved out on a rainy Saturday morning. Not far. Just 15 minutes away. Enough to give us all space. But close enough for Sunday dinners. We helped her set up the place. Dylan carried the boxes. I hung the curtain rods. Zoe picked out a housewarming plant from a nursery near the river and placed it in the kitchen with a card that read, "For Grandma's new adventures." The apartment was small, but bright. A clean start. She unpacked her mugs, one by one, lined them on open shelves, and stood back like someone admiring a painting they didn't think they'd ever see again. In the weeks that followed, she surprised me, not by staying away, but by choosing her presence carefully. She called before visiting. She asked before offering advice. She even started contributing to a local design co-op, sharing her expertise in small weekend workshops for younger women trying to enter the field. "I forgot how much I loved this," she told me one evening. "Being useful without being in charge." I nodded. Not out of politeness, but out of understanding. It takes courage to let go of roles that once defined you, and even more to admit that control isn't the same thing as care. One day, I stopped by her place to return a book she had lent Zoe. The apartment smelled like jasmine tea and wood polish. She was listening to Miles Davis on vinyl, barefoot, wearing jeans. I didn't think I'd ever seen her in denim before. She looked younger, or maybe just lighter. As I handed her the book, she placed it on the coffee table and said, "Do you know, the moment I knew I had judged you unfairly, I waited, unsure whether I wanted to hear it. It was the night you didn't say I told you so," she continued. "When I had nothing left, you didn't humiliate me. You let me sit in my shame without adding to it. And it taught me more than any lecture ever could." A few months passed, and Marjorie settled into her new place with more grace than I expected. She called occasionally to ask for Zoe's latest drawings, or to share a new soup recipe she had adjusted for fewer calories but more flavor. There was a time when those calls would have felt intrusive, like a way of inserting herself into our life without asking. Now, they felt measured, earnest. I found myself picking up on the first ring, not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to. Something between us had quietly rebalanced, and I wasn't sure when exactly it happened. Maybe during the slow unpacking in her apartment, maybe in the weeks she let us breathe without pushing herself back in. Maybe it started the moment she finally stopped trying to be right. Then one afternoon, Dylan came home with a letter in his hand. He looked stunned, not alarmed, just deeply unsettled. He handed it to me without a word. It was from Marjorie. A printed, signed letter. Formal. Almost too formal. She had decided to sell the last of the family assets still in her name, a small stake in the Cooper Foundation's archival holdings. She explained that she didn't need the money but wanted to make peace with her legacy. She had also left instructions to transfer half of it directly to Zoe's college savings. The other half was earmarked for a local women's mentorship program she had started volunteering for quietly the month prior. I used to think legacy was about control, she wrote. Now I think it's about what you leave behind when you're no longer in the room. Dylan stared at the wall for a long time that evening. Eventually, he said, I never thought she'd let go of that name. And I knew what he meant. His mother had spent most of her life treating the Cooper legacy like an inheritance carved in stone, one that needed to be protected from people like me. People who didn't come from pedigree, who didn't speak the same language of summer houses and curated interiors. But in choosing to step away from the family trust, she had chosen something else entirely. Autonomy, humility, maybe even love. Around the same time, I was invited to give a keynote at a regional conference on design equity. I hadn't spoken publicly since before the pandemic, and the idea of returning to a stage made my stomach flutter. But I said yes, partly out of curiosity, partly because I wanted to see if I still had something to say. I spent weeks preparing, refining my message, polishing the flow. The morning of the talk, Dylan surprised me by bringing Zoe to the venue, dressed in a tiny blazer and holding a homemade Go Mom sign. But what caught me most off guard was who I saw standing near the back of the room as I stepped on stage. Marjorie, dressed simply, holding a notebook, listening, really listening. After the speech, she approached with quiet eyes and said nothing about the content or the crowd. Instead, she placed her hand gently on my forearm and said, You held the room like it belonged to you. Then she nodded and left. It was the first time in nearly a decade of knowing her that she didn't comment on how I looked, what I wore, or how I represented the family. Just that I belonged. That was enough. A few days later, I invited her to lunch at a small cafe I liked, the kind of place she used to call urban farm affectation under her breath. She arrived 5 minutes early. Hair pulled back. No pearls. Just a cardigan and a quiet smile. We talked about the conference, about Zoe's science project, about the real estate market. I asked if she missed her old house. She stirred her tea slowly and said, Sometimes, mostly the garden, but not the silence. I didn't ask what she meant by that. I had seen enough of her old life to know silence wasn't always the absence of sound. Sometimes it was the absence of connection, of truth, of being known. As we walked out of the cafe, she paused near the crosswalk and looked at me directly. You know, I spent years thinking I had to protect Dylan from the world, she said. Then I realized I was protecting him from the wrong things. From growing up, from choosing for himself, from being proud of someone who didn't look like his past. I exhaled slowly. Not because I was surprised by her honesty, but because I had waited a long time to hear it. You don't have to keep proving anything to me, Sarah, she added. You never did. But I kept needing you to try, because it made me feel important. We stood in silence for a moment, the city breathing around us. Then I said, I'm glad you finally see it. She nodded. I'm glad I finally let myself. And just like that, something old inside. Both of us let go. The day Marjorie called to ask if we could have dinner at her place, I paused longer than usual before answering. It wasn't a command, not a suggestion wrapped in silk. It was a simple invitation, one that left room for no. I said yes, partly out of curiosity, partly because something in her voice sounded different. That Saturday, we arrived at her apartment just before 6. Zoe held a bouquet of flowers we had picked together, and Dylan carried a bottle of wine. Even though Marjorie didn't really drink anymore, her apartment had changed since the first time we helped her move in. Gone were the traces of forced minimalism. Now there were plants on every windowsill, mismatched dishes, stacked with intention, and a corkboard near the kitchen, where she'd pinned Zoe's drawings alongside handwritten quotes. Nothing about the space looked expensive, but everything looked chosen. Dinner was simple: roasted vegetables, a grain salad, a pot of lemon herb soup that made the whole apartment smell like late spring. We ate slowly, talked about books, music, and how Zoe wanted to build a birdhouse but needed help with a saw. Marjorie offered instantly. No commentary, no passiva correction. Just help. Later, while Dylan and Zoe played cards on the floor, Marjorie poured us both tea and sat beside me on the small sofa she had thrifted and reupholstered herself. She didn't speak right away, and I didn't rush her. Then she asked, very quietly, if I remembered the first night I had dinner at her old house. Of course, I said. You served duck, and asked if I'd keep working after marriage. She winced. Not theatrically, but genuinely. I thought I was being practical, but I was being arrogant. I didn't say anything. Just let the words settle. I was terrified, she continued. Not of you. Not really. Of losing my place in his life. Dylan was all I had left. And then you arrived. Calm and certain and full of ideas. I didn't understand, and instead of learning from you, I defended myself the only way I knew how. With judgment. With control. It was the closest she had come to laying her full truth on the table. And I realized, in that moment, that the woman who used to evaluate every room she entered was now choosing to stay still in one. It's taken me a long time to stop performing, she said. Even longer to stop defending things that weren't worth protecting. That night, on the way home, Dylan asked what we thought about inviting his mother over for Zoe's birthday. We hadn't held it at our house the past 2 years. Too many memories. Too much history tied to cake cutting and strained conversation. But this time felt different. I nodded. Let's make it simple. And just for family. The word didn't feel loaded anymore. The party was small. Just close friends and a few cousins. Marjorie arrived with a homemade scrapbook she had spent months assembling. Each page told a story about Zoe's milestones, filled with photos, ticket stubs, doodles, and her own gentle handwriting. She handed it to Zoe like a treasure, then stood back quietly, while our daughter flipped through the pages, squealing at every sticker and caption. I caught Marjorie watching her, not with pride, but with awe. The kind of awe that comes from finally seeing what's in front of you, instead of what you wish it would be. After the party, I walked her to her car. She opened the driver's door, then paused and turned to me. You know, she said, I used to think motherhood was about holding tight. Now I think it's about knowing when to step back and let someone else lead. I didn't correct her, didn't add anything about how long it took, or how much it cost. I just said, thank you for saying that. She nodded and drove off slowly. 1. Hand out the window, waving to Zoe as she passed. That night, as I folded gift wrap and rinsed plates, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not relief, not triumph, not even closure. Just balance. Like the house, for the first time in years, had no shadows lingering in the corners. Dylan came up behind me, wrapped his arms around my waist, and said, I think she's finally okay. I turned to him, kissed his shoulder, and whispered, so are we? When the email came in from the agency, I was standing barefoot in the kitchen, trying to find the lid to Zoe's lunchbox. The subject line was simple, almost dull, speaking opportunity inquiry. I nearly deleted it, assuming it was one of those mass outreach lists I had somehow landed on. But something about the sender's name made me stop. It was the same boutique branding firm Dylan's cousin once tried to pitch for, the same one Marjorie had quoted during one of our early arguments about professional presence. I opened the email. It was direct, polite, and flattering without being dramatic. They had seen my recent case study about storytelling and brand rehabilitation. They wanted me to speak at a panel titled Narrative Trust and the Future of Communication. It wasn't massive, but it was real, and it was mine. I reread the email twice before replying, not because I didn't know what to say, but because for the first time in years, I realized I didn't need to ask anyone's permission. Not Dylan's, not my manager's, and certainly not Marjorie's. I confirmed the spot, added the date to my calendar, and resumed packing lunch like nothing had changed. Though everything had. The event itself took place 3 weeks later at a modest hotel downtown, the kind with too much velvet and too little natural light. I arrived early, not because I was nervous, but because I wanted to walk the stage alone. I stood behind the podium, adjusted the mic, and looked out at the rows of chairs. I didn't imagine applause. I imagined clarity. When the room finally filled, I stepped up and delivered my talk calmly, clearly, without rushing. I didn't try to be impressive. I told the truth. About trust. About silence. About how communication fails when people are more invested in control than connection. When it ended, there was a moment of stillness before people began clapping. I didn't bow. I didn't beam. I just stood tall and thanked them. And in that moment, I felt the version of myself I had nearly lost finally catch up. After the panel, I slipped out early, walked down the street to a quiet cafe, and ordered an espresso I didn't really need. I sat near the window and watched the city unfold without urgency. Then my phone buzzed. It was a message from Dylan. Just a photo of Zoe in her Halloween costume. She had chosen to be an architect this year, clipboard and all. I smiled, replied with a heart, and for the first time in a long time, I felt not only proud of my daughter, but proud of the person she was modeling after. Later that night, as I recapped the day over dinner, Dylan asked if I wanted to share the talk online. I said no, not yet, not because I was afraid, but because it felt like something that deserved to stay intimate for a little longer. He didn't push. Instead, he raised his glass and said, "To reclaiming space." It was such a simple phrase, but it struck something deep. Not about revenge. Not about proving anyone wrong. Just about taking back what was mine all along. That weekend, Marjorie came by to return a scarf Zoe had left behind. She stayed for tea, asked about the panel, and listened as I recounted a few moments from the event. She didn't interrupt, didn't insert herself into the narrative. At one point, she even said, "You're really good at this. I hope you know that." I nodded, not out of politeness, but because I believed it, and maybe that's what changed most. I didn't need her validation anymore, but receiving it didn't feel empty either. It just felt neutral, balanced. As she left, she paused at the door and said, "I used to think being enough meant being everything, but I think it just means knowing what's yours to carry." I watched her walk to her car with measured steps, no longer stiff, no longer performing. She didn't look back, and I didn't need her to. That night, while brushing Zoe's hair, she asked me if I was famous now. I laughed and said, "No, just louder than before." She nodded, then said something I won't forget. "It's good to be loud if you're saying something true." And somehow, that sentence said everything. The day the email from Luminex Media landed in my inbox, I was halfway through organizing Zoe's closet. The agency was launching a campaign focused on ethical storytelling and wanted to feature 3 female strategists who had made a measurable impact in their industries through quiet, resilient leadership. I wasn't just one of the people they were considering. I was their first choice. They'd read the article I published in Insight Quarterly and were struck by how I framed boundaries, not as resistance, but as design. I reread the message twice, then just stared at the screen, stunned, not by the recognition, but by how much I no longer needed it to feel valid. I said yes because it felt right, not because I needed to prove anything to anyone, especially not to Marjorie. 2 weeks later, we filmed the interview at a sunlit studio just outside the city. It was calm, respectful. No one asked about my personal life. No one questioned how I balanced work and parenting. They asked about ideas, processes, the way visual language heals broken trust. At the end of the day, the director pulled me aside and said, "You talk like someone who rebuilt something no one else saw break." I smiled without answering, because I knew he was right. The interview was released a month later. It wasn't viral. It wasn't dramatic, but it made quiet waves in the professional space. My inbox began to fill, not with applause, but with thoughtful invitations. Strategy firms wanted to consult. Creative directors asked for advice. Former colleagues wrote to say they finally understood the decisions I had made. Even a university reached out to ask if I'd consider mentoring students in their digital ethics program. It wasn't fame. It was something better. It was trust. Earned, not claimed. Meanwhile, Marjorie's situation began to change. Slowly. At first, her contract at the agency wasn't renewed. The board had shifted, and the new leadership wanted someone less anchored to legacy ways. She didn't tell me directly. I heard it from Dylan. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then she started stopping by more often, under different excuses. A forgotten charger. A question about Zoe's school pickup. Eventually, she asked if she could stay for a few nights. I hesitated, but said yes. Not out of pity, but because I could now make that choice from a place of clarity, not obligation. She arrived with 2 suitcases and a brittle smile. We didn't talk much the first night. She kept to the guest room. I cooked a simple dinner. We didn't mention the past. Not the things she had said. Not the space she once tried to take up in this house with sharp comments and sharper silences. But in the days that followed, something shifted. She started asking instead of assuming. She listened more than she spoke. She folded Zoe's laundry without comment and left thank you notes on the counter. One morning, I caught her staring at the photo wall in the hallway. She lingered in front of a picture of me and Zoe, building our first sandbox. Her expression was unreadable, but she looked tired. Not from age, from effort, like she had spent too long pretending to stand on ground that wasn't hers. A few nights later, over tea, she finally said it. "I used to think being the loudest meant being the most certain. But you were always working from a different map." I said nothing, because she didn't need comfort. She needed space to hear herself. And in that silence, I realized something. Her downfall wasn't my victory. It wasn't even her punishment. It was just gravity. The slow return of someone who had lived too long above consequence. That weekend, Zoe asked why Grandma was staying longer. I told her. Sometimes adults need time to remember who they are when no one's clapping. She nodded. Then asked if she could show Marjorie her new storybook. That afternoon, they sat side by side in the sunroom, flipping through pages, saying nothing at all. Marjorie would eventually move out. Not far, just a few blocks away. She didn't ask for help packing. She just thanked me and said, "You gave me space when I only deserved distance." I said, "We all unlearn things in different ways." She left quietly, with less weight than when she came. The last time I saw Marjorie at my door, she wasn't holding a suitcase or a judgment. She was holding Zoe's lunchbox, which we had forgotten during the morning rush. It was such a simple thing, so ordinary, yet it carried a quiet significance. Neither of us acknowledged. She handed it over with a small smile, then stood there, uncertain, as if waiting for permission she didn't need anymore. I nodded and said, "Thanks," and that was enough. She left without asking to come in, without glancing back. That silence was the real ending. Not dramatic, just peaceful. And after everything, that felt like the most unexpected result. I once thought closure would look like confrontation, a slammed door, a shouted truth. But the real closure came like breath returning to the lungs after holding too long. It came in small acknowledgments, in undone power plays, in the quiet decision to stop performing pain for those who caused it. I didn't need Marjorie to apologize anymore. I didn't need her to change for my story to continue. The weight of what she once said about me not being enough didn't disappear, but it stopped being the axis around which I spun my decisions. In the months that followed, the work I had done began to ripple outward. I was invited to speak on a panel about narrative integrity in digital strategy, sitting beside people whose names once lived only on the covers of books I underlined in graduate school. I wore no armor, just a gray wool coat and a notebook filled with thoughts I had tested through lived experience. I spoke softly, but with precision, not to impress, but to offer clarity. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I had to justify my place in the room. Zoe grew. Her drawings turned into stories, her questions into insights. She once asked me why Grandma used to sound angry when I spoke. I said, "Sometimes people use volume to cover fear." She thought about it, then asked if she sounded loud when she was scared. I said yes, sometimes, and that it was okay, because the important thing was to listen after the noise. I realized then that the real legacy I was shaping wasn't about career milestones or vindication. It was about teaching her that value isn't earned through approval, but through presence and consistency. One morning, while sipping coffee on the porch, I received a call from my former agency's HR director. She wanted to let me know that my name had been added to a project credit I had worked on years ago, the one Marjorie had originally erased me from. It would appear on the agency's portfolio going forward. I thanked her, not because it changed anything now, but because I knew someone inside had finally seen the full picture. I didn't feel a rush of justice. I just felt alignment. Like the truth had found its way through without me having to scream it. A few days later, I ran into Leonard, an old client, at a design conference. He asked if I was still freelancing. I said I had stopped calling it that. I now ran a quiet studio with 2 collaborators. We only took on projects rooted in honesty and long-term narrative architecture. He laughed and said, "That sounds like something you would build." It was a compliment, but it was also a recognition. I had become the kind of strategist who didn't chase acclaim, only impact. The kind of professional who knew that revenge stories are just pain wearing makeup, and that the real triumph lies in walking away from the noise with your values intact. Later that night, as I closed the studio for the evening, I passed by the wall where we pinned our core ethos. One line read, "We are not here to be liked. We are here to be clear." I smiled, because that used to scare me. Now, it steadied me. Clarity doesn't require cruelty. Boundary don't require bitterness. And distance, when earned, can be the most generous form of love. So yes, my mother-in-law once said I would never be enough. She judged the way I lived, the way I worked, even the way I existed in her son's life. And now, she lives 3 blocks away, quietly respectful, occasionally kind. Not because I forced her to change, but because I stopped performing for her approval. I didn't win by shouting louder. I won by becoming someone who no longer needed the noise. And maybe that's the real ending. Not a door slamming. Not a comeback soaked in applause. Just a woman on her porch, sipping coffee, knowing that the silence she once feared has now become her power. So now, let me ask you this. Who would you become if you stopped needing them to understand you?